everybody. It's nice to, we can't see you, but it's nice that you guys are here with us. My name is Susan Barrett, and I am with the Center for Social Behavior Supports at Old Dominion University and a center partner with the National TA Center on PBIS. And I'm joined by my colleague, Kimberly Yannick. Kimberly, you want to say hello?
Good morning, everyone. Welcome.
We are really happy that you joined us. We are going to talk about building and maintaining buy-in, handling kind of the naysayers, and securing buy-in for all in this ever-changing landscape we find ourselves in these days. So with that, we want to acknowledge a couple of things, and then we want to invite you to offer and engage with us in chat some of your thoughts and things that you're thinking about as you read that title for this webinar. But as we're adapting to the new context, and just kind of want to sit with that for a second and acknowledge that we are in kind of brand new territory, if you will. We have such an increased magnitude of need, combined with staff shortages across the board, whether that be in leadership, classroom teachers, paraprofessionals, our mental health clinicians, combined with the political context. There is a significant, as you know, focus on mental health and significant funding coming our way for focusing and spotlighting on the mental health needs of our youth and our staff. And we're also seeing really extreme behaviors, right? So really complex things, but we also know that there's variability, both in terms of the impact at the individual level, family level, and school community level. And then really thinking about kind of holding the tension between what we're seeing inside our classrooms and inside of our schools and kind of the demands that are still remaining, kind of the expectations prior to 2020 in terms of keep with, on pace curriculum and testing, and all of those things are kind of continuing on, even though all these things, these kind of crises, if you will, are happening within our schools. And how do you strike the balance and kind of hold that tension for a minute? So if you could engage with us in chat, you will not be able to unmute yourself for this webinar, but you can engage with us in chat. Let us know who you are, the district, state, and role that you have, and what are you seeing in terms of how staff buy-in and commitment to anything, really, any initiative right now has changed over the last 3 years. And so I'll just hit the pause button and let you kind of reflect on that question, engage with us in chat for a second. Thank you so much to Austin, who's offered the link that this session will be recorded, is being recorded, and it will be posted on the pbis.org site. And thank you, Austin, for providing that link in case you want to share this with colleagues. So again, just let us know who you are, the role that you have in your system and your district or state that you're working with. Oh, thank you, Ashley. Great to have you with us today. Chamberlain High School in Hillsborough County. Thank you so much, Ashley. Great to have you with us. And again, would love to know some of the things that you're seeing in terms of how staff have changed over the last, staff buy-in and commitment and wellness really have changed over the last 3 years. Buy-in has increased slightly. Oh, that's fantastic, Ashley. I wish we could get you off mute and have you tell us a little bit more about what you are seeing and how it's increased. So I will continue on, but continue to think about the ways that it has changed and the way we are adapting how we provide supports to staff knowing that there is kind of next level exhaustion. So keep letting us know in the chat what you're thinking, and let us know where you are located and what your role is. Okay, so just a little bit of context again, as we think about what's happened over the last 3 years, again, there's variability across the landscape, but I really think that we are still in a phase of crisis response and recovery, or disaster crisis and recovery. And, SAMHSA has offered kind of phases over that recovery period. And I don't think we've actually had time to process what's happened to us. And so many things every day are kind of coming at us that really don't allow us to kind of hit that pause button and reflect on really what's happened to us. And so I want to kind of offer some language that I wonder if we're still really in kind of an initial stage of crisis response and recovery. Maybe we're in disillusionment phase, where that's marked by kind of this fatigue and realization that recovery is likely to take some time. It's a phase where behavioral health issues really begin to peak. And we see incidents of depression and rates of suicide, along with increasing rates of alcohol and drug use. And certainly we're seeing that reflected out from the national trends and patterns that are emerging. Or maybe your system is in reconstruction phase, where the rise in symptoms related to the anniversary can cause increased grief and loss. So just kind of reflecting on what SAMHSA has offered us and that thinking, and recognizing that we probably have a longer journey ahead. And how do we pace ourselves and really laser focus on what it is we need to do right now? And what are the things we can put on the back burner? Because these behaviors are ways that folks are communicating to us that they need something different. And so one resource that we'd like to offer you right off the bat is a brief that we published a couple of years ago that talks a little bit more about that, those phases. And one of the things we want to kind of highlight and focus on today is initial recovery phase. And how do we situate prioritizing staff wellness and investing in stabilizing the learning environment, right? Those tier 1 classroom practices that ensure that our students and faculty and staff are living in a very healthy environment, right? It's positive, it's predictable, it's stable, it's consistent, it's nurturing, it's loving. People are finding joy in those spaces. We're taking breaks and having fun and playing games, right? And really kind of pulling in movement. So what are the ways that we can laser focus on that? And what are the things that we can kind of put on the back burner? The other brief that we're really building off today is this brief on building a culture of staff wellness through a multi-tiered system of support. And we've offered webinars in the past specifically around this. And so we'll make sure you get access to those resources as well. So as we come into thinking about how we prioritize staff, because we're not going to get healthy kids unless our workforce are living in a healthy environment, and there's organizational health there, and our staff feel like they're being cared for and nurtured for. And so think about your current status, and I'm seeing folks populate some other considerations as you guys are really kind of leaning into the importance of staff wellness too, and getting increased buy-in on that critical kind of priority that a lot of our systems are focused on. And so that's really great news. What's the leadership role in creating a culture of care and recovery? How might we use human resources and employee assistance in our insurance plans to really not just think about support and care when we need individualized support, but really kind of pulling down some of those resources that we all could take advantage of on a regular basis? And how do we reduce the demands and really start to deliberately align and consolidate our teaming structures, our data systems, and really think about the way that we have been set up to be really fragmented and siloed? And how do we de-implement some of those things that just aren't working or don't have evidence behind them. And we just don't have enough bandwidth to be able to pull it off. So we're really just going to have a laser focus on just a small number of things. So as we're thinking about current status, I wonder if you might reflect on some data that you might be looking at related to climate data that staff are letting us know, or maybe a simple survey and understanding, what percentage of the system that you're involved in of staff feel like they're connected and feel like they've got a sense of belonging to the school community. What percentage of staff are meeting that attendance requirement? What percentage of staff feel like they can manage their workload right now and have the skills to handle the magnitude of social, emotional, behavioral needs? So just kind of thinking about some data that reflects some trends and patterns that might be emerging so that we might rally around that feedback and really kick it up a notch for staff. And so I'm going to turn it over to Kimberly now that will kind of unpack that a little bit more. Kimberly?
Thanks, Susan. And I'm looking at the chat too. I love the feedback that people are providing. There's a high turnover in administrators and staff as administrators and teachers, mental health providers, all of those folks are coming into our space, this school community. And so having that data that Susan just mentioned and just continuing unpacking a little bit broadly on teacher well-being, and I would add well-being as Carolyn raised for us in the chat. And some of the research that's out there around teacher well-being, it's kind of like common sense, but it's worth revisiting. Like, yes, exactly. And some of the things that we're learning is that these well-being efforts are always coming from a good place of good intention, but thinking about them in advance, looking at the data maybe that Susan just shared or any other kind of data you might have. And how do we look at ways to embed it within the workday, within the school culture, making it part of the way we show up every day? How do we look at focusing on, moving away from SOS, shiny object syndrome, which we tend to do in education? There's some shiny new thing and we want to do that. We want to do this. And we never take anything off the plate. How do we cultivate healthy relationships, a culture of trust where it's okay to make mistakes and say, I don't know. And there are people there that we can connect with and support one another. And so we can look at those, and then we can think about some other research where really when it comes to education, so we can go broadly into organizational workforce across domains, business, medical field, education. But specific to education, we're talking about this construct of well-being in the culture and environment of a school. And so I used to work with an organization, and we used to call it forced fun because it was well-intended, but it was these wellness or building, team building activities that were provided outside of the normal workday, where we're already taxed and already, trying to juggle and balance work and personal efforts. And so thinking about those as we think about commitment and buy-in that's really based in teacher wellness, and asking our staff. One of the things that came up in the research when we were reading through this and reviewing is that, we oftentimes wait and we respond in downstream mode. We respond to teacher wellness, if you will, administrator wellness. And instead of that, why not anticipate and get in front of it? And right now we can anticipate that people are still, as Susan said, in this phase of recovery that we really are struggling. So how do we think about that, as we plan things? So part of that is building, this culture of psychological safety and thinking about how do we make it, just normalize it. Getting rid of the stigma, not only for students, but also for staff to have experiences where we can talk about these things that are impacting us, all of these things outside of the school community that are impacting our school community. and creating structures and practices that allow us to notice one another, because all of these things may show up, right? We all can relate to this, I'm sure. When I struggle, I know that there's a change in my work habit, my behavior. It manifests itself physically, of course. And I have a support system in my colleagues, where we can support one another. And how are we organized to make space for that? As Susan said, so that we're looking at staff. Can we have checkpoints? Little things, just teeny little micro movements into this might make the biggest difference. So some administrators have put daily bookends, quick huddles at the beginning and the end of the day, checking in with staff. Working with schools this week alone, we had 18 vacancies in one day, where a school population of 500 students. That's a lot on people and trying to navigate that. How do we check in, anticipate, again, that's going to be stressful? Let's check in at the beginning of the day. Let's check in at the end of the day. How did it work? How do we adjust? How do we build in pauses throughout the day as a school-wide effort, where we're acknowledging this need to create this culture of well-being, not only for the students, but for the staff? So thinking about those things that you build in. Standardized movement breaks. Working with a district that said, we all need to move throughout the day. Can we build it into the schedule where at the top of every hour, we spend 5 minutes as a preventative thing for everyone, staff and students, to get up and move, to just, take a break. Looking at things, I know Susan and I were working together recently, and we were going to send an email out after 5. Don't tell anyone. But we got a little thing like, hey, are you sure you want to do that? This might be after hours. And I hadn't noticed that. And it was just created this awareness for me, like, oh my gosh, what a brilliant thing to do. Like, can this wait? Because you know how we are. If we are connected, we notice it, we feel this impulse. And even if we don't respond, it weighs on us. It takes up space, mental space, emotional space. And so thinking about these things, looking at your schedule and how do we really create time for true collaboration, not only around planning for the academic instruction, but also for the social, emotional, behavioral support that needs to be embedded throughout the day, not just on Mondays from 9 to 9:15. How are we teaching our school-wide expectations with explicit instruction and then embedding them throughout the day? And wouldn't it be lovely if we had a team of colleagues where we're all doing that together? It doesn't fall on the shoulders of one. We have a schedule that says we're saying yes to this, and we're going to make time for this collaboration and be creative and with scheduling and people. Talking to this principal at the school that had all of these staff members out, he's doing that. And every day it's like, okay, we had to reposition people today to do this. And we're not going to let go of teaching the social, emotional, behavioral to students, because those skill sets are necessary. And how are we creating that conditions for the adults to be able to do that work? And so I want to, and here's just one other example, and Susan, please add to this, but it's basically a district-wide initiative, right? With a district you work with a buddy system. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of similar to check in, check out, right? That we do for students, only we had one important person have our back across the day. And so this comes from the work at CDC. And so they just lifted that up and started to do this district-wide. What I also love about this example for this specific district is they held space for it, right? They actually put it in a schedule, and they took something off their plate. They took morning meetings off their plate to encourage being able to have that time and space to check in with one another. So we just wanted to offer that example too.
Yeah. And I love in the coaching space, one of the great coaching questions, to help us make time for these is, if we're saying yes to this, what are we saying no to? So if we're saying yes to, we value teacher wellness, administrator wellness, staff wellness, what do we have to say no to? What do we have to stop doing and make more time for? So when we think of teacher wellness, and we can think broadly, and we're going to just look at this notion of burnout, because burnout requires an organizational response. And when we're working in three-tiered frameworks, MTSS, PBIS, we're working in organizational change, systems change. That's not to say that we as individuals don't have a responsibility for our own self-care. And the burnout epidemic, which is preventable, is really about an organizational response. So if you haven't had a chance to pick up this book by Jennifer Moss, it's fantastic. And in it, she goes through some things in the research that are just kind of raised up to our attention about things that lead to burnout. Probably no surprises there. The workload, the perceived lack of control. Number 3, please pay attention to, and we're going to unpack some of this, lack of reward or recognition, or I might say acknowledgement and appreciation, poor relationships, lack of fairness, values mismatch. So what she offers us is that, burnout and staff, the great resignation, these are all real things, staff turnover. And so how do we look at what we do within a three-tiered framework? Maybe it's PBIS, MTSS, and leverage the things we're already doing as antidotes, if you will, to burnout. So we're going to pivot to that now and look at what are the things that we're already doing in this work, and do we need to spiral back to them and revisit them with intention around uncovering ways to prevent burnout or to respond to burnout or get in front of it. So one of the things that shows up is really getting clear on our why. When we talk about buy-in and commitment, why are we implementing PBIS maybe as an example of an MTSS? And so when you look at the research on the why, you can see on that next slide that we've organized it into buckets that we can look at. And love this quote from Education Secretary, where we look at saying yes to mental well-being, saying yes to wellness, not as if there's time, we'll get to it. But we look at it instead as really the foundation in which we are building on our, I'm going to use quotes, recovery efforts, if you will, around academics, around social, emotional, and behavior manifesting in ways that perhaps we've not experienced in the past or at greater frequency levels. And so when we look at the research behind PBIS, which is an example of an MTSS, and we can look at those 3 buckets, I just want to give you a moment, if you haven't seen some of the latest synthesis, if you will, of the research that's available to us. Look at the buckets around improved student outcomes, reduced exclusionary discipline, improved teacher outcomes. Do you see anything in there that you can relate to that perhaps are part of your strategic planning goals? Or why you chose to implement an MTSS, PBIS, whatever it is you're doing in this space? Getting really clear and communicating your why you're doing this work is critical for buy-in and commitment, an ongoing commitment. And the communication piece is really important because oftentimes, because in education we're plagued with SOS, shiny object syndrome, it's, oh, here's the latest and greatest. And perhaps we don't have a process in place that says, look at our data. Here's our current reality and what's showing up. Here's what we have in place to address that. We've got some gaps, or we don't have something to address that. And that's why we're bringing this thing in, whatever it is. So being really clear on the why. And if I'm looking at this research here, Susan just said something one day that was like, oh my goodness, yes. This is a mental health initiative. as much as anything else, if we look at the outcomes that are there that we're finding when we implement with fidelity, that we can get to under those conditions and that research. So instead of looking at things in a siloed approach, taking the time to get clear on our why, and then we're going to look at some other things that we can be doing to really look at the workload and the ways in which we engage with that workload are going to be a critical antidote to this burnout, to the buy-in, to facilitating ongoing commitment. So if we look at resource mapping or initiative mapping or anything you might call it, asset mapping in a community, but really just taking inventory of everything you have. And I see this as something we often skip over as a state or a district or a school team. But I think it's an undervalued exercise that we might revisit ongoing to uncover, look at all the SOS showing up, look at all the shiny object syndromes, shiny new initiatives that we are implementing. Where do we need to look for opportunities to stop doing? So that, remember, that very first cause of burnout was a workload. And so let's just look at what are the basics that we need. Why are we doing this thing called XYZ that the district, mandated a century ago, and we're no longer mandated, we're no longer doing it? Or why are we doing this thing and we don't have any evidence to suggest if it's having an impact or if we're doing it with fidelity? Or why are we doing that thing that somebody went to a conference and saw and it was sparkly and they said, we're going to bring that back here? Really analyzing all that we're asking administrators and teachers to do, and I would say district level staff as well. Can we look at ways to de-implement? And we'll look at that in a minute. Can we look at, do we really have the resources available to implement all of these things in our continuum? And are there things we can align so that we're not teaching what's on the matrix, if you will, for social emotional behavior on Wednesdays, and we're not doing social emotional learning curriculum on Mondays, and we're not doing trauma informed on Tuesday, but we're analyzing what it is we're doing, and we're looking for ways to align the practices and the support systems. Support system, and as an example, might be professional learning. So this department does professional learning and they talk about something this way, and this department does professional learning, they talk about it that way. And then the principals and the administrators and the teachers are like, well, which do we do? So really you're addressing those first two indicators or things that might lead to burnout just through resource or initiative mapping. And always asking ourselves that question, okay, here are we just did this in a district, and I kid you not, I think we had 30 pages of initiatives, and it was small print, small rows of what we do across the continuum. And I said, if we're saying yes to all this, what are we saying no to? Right? We're saying no to teacher wellness. We're saying no to administrator wellness. We're saying no to really meaningful impacts, possibly with our students. So resource mapping, initiative mapping, and then if you look at this next idea around de-implementation, Susan mentioned this in the very beginning. Not only what can we stop de-implementing for all the reasons just we've talked about, but can we also de-implement some of the harmful things that we might be doing? Can we put a heavy focus on prevention so that we have less of a need to rely on some of those things that traditionally that we just are default? Exclusionary discipline as a default, referral to special ed as a default. Can we look at de-implementation of these things that can be harmful, that don't have evidence behind them? And can we work on mindset and create conditions to support the adults that there's really no magic fairy dust approach to changing and building pro-social skills or changing social emotional behavioral habits for any of us as humans. It's really about changing the conditions under which. And so if we can think about that, that is going to move us to that culture and that workforce support that is an antidote to possibly to burnout. If we look to this next little piece here, this is something you're already doing. We are already, if we're implementing a PBIS, MTSS, we're already looking at a systems approach to creating a culture where we acknowledge and show appreciation. We do that for students, and I sometimes find that we overlook that for staff. So, as district leaders, as school leaders, as colleagues with one another, how are you front loading your system where we have opportunities to connect with one another? Remember, not those compulsory things after hours, but within the hours of the workday, opportunities for connection. Do you have that 5-minute stretch break at the top of every hour? Can we go into the hallway with a nice routine around it and connect with one another, and then have a routine for getting back to work right away? Can we start as leaders in this space, model that when someone puts a bid in for attention, that we turn towards them and not away from them? Sometimes those bids manifest as behaviors that we maybe don't care for in our students and the adults, but can we, start to practice being more mindful of bids for attention? Is that a bid for attention? Are we front loading our system with turning towards one another, building trust? These are all antidotes to burnout and stress, and we're already doing it if we're implementing a school-wide approach to acknowledgement. You can look at some of this additional research here where we look at just behavior-specific praise. And if you click one more time, this is across domains. It's not just education. This shows up in workforce. And what they did is some research around the use of behavior-specific praise. And what they found was there's a lower turnover rate, right? 79% of employees who quit their jobs, one of the reasons when we did that exit interview, lack of appreciation as a reason for leaving. And look at the impact of workforce or our staff, that appreciation, someone noticing that we're showing up every day, knowing there's all this stuff going on in all of our lives, noticing that we are, engaging with our students, connecting with our students. We're doing the things that we've agreed to do. Just noticing that, getting in the mindset of showing that appreciation and using behavior-specific praise is a huge factor and an antidote, if you will, to burnout, to stress. I can't say enough about it. And you can look to BB on the next slide is code for Brene Brown. So anybody who has been with me before, that I am a groupie of Brene Brown's research. And if you don't know her, she has books and podcasts, really easy to get access to her, but also Gottman Institute and their work. And they look at this notion of using behavior-specific praise or turning to acknowledging and noticing bids for attention as something that is key, perhaps one of the most important things we can do to connect and build a relationship. And so some of the things in that space that they offer us is if our staff are stressed out, if our administrators are stressed out, the best thing we can do, we don't have to have the answer. We just can show up and have that space and listen and have empathy. Like, I don't know the answer, but I'm here to listen. And so empathy is one of those skills, if you will, skill sets, I would say skill sets, that is something we might consider as part of this foundation for well-being and building a positive culture to implement anything, as Susan said. So we're going to look in a moment, how might we break down empathy, for example, of one of those observable, measurable skill sets. And if we're implementing a school-wide approach to social emotional behavior, one of the things we do is always define, well, what does this behavior look like and sound like, right? I didn't know what empathy looked like and sound like until I started, stalking Brene Brown's website and all of her books and everything. And now I get it. I'm like, ooh, just like we unpack academic standards, we can unpack the pro-social skills and get the verbs out. What is it? What would I be saying and doing if I was using empathy? So there are other skill sets you might look at, like how do we unpack self-compassion? But I want to just look at the next look here at empathy. So we could use, it's a combination really of Brene Brown and Kristen Neff's work around empathy. And if you look at these things, this is a breakdown, and there are other definitions out there, of course. I just go, these are my go-tos, but perspective taking. And what does that look like and sound like? Staying out of judgment. Aren't we humans great at judging? How do we create conditions to practice mindfulness around staying out of judgment, noticing it when it shows up, saying, I hear you, I see you, not now, whatever your strategy is to stay out of judgment, recognizing the emotions, right? I don't have to have the answer, but I might say something like, gosh, it sounds like you're feeling frustrated. I'm sorry, it sounds like you're feeling angry about what happened, and just holding that space and acknowledging that. Communicating that you heard someone, listening and letting them know I heard you. And then self-compassion. This empathy takes practice. It takes a lot of practice to do these things. So, I am the first person to make out my little critical voice, like, oh yeah, I didn't do that day. And I'm having to practice what Kristen Neff offers us around self-compassion and say, I'm human too, and I'm in this space of learning. So how do we create these conditions, all of these things, if, for example, empathy is something that we think would help us cultivate wellness across staff and students? And so if we look at what we do in our work, we can look and see where there's examples coming up here about how we could embed this. So we might have school-wide expectations when we're implementing something like a PBIS. And they might be, we are kind, we are responsible, we are respectful and affirming, we are physically and emotionally safe. And we might embed some of those skill sets. Look at that. We practice perspective taking. That's a skill set that could be part of empathy. So we start to not only define them, but let's embed them in what we're already doing. You can see another example here. This was an elementary school where they had grade level cooperative planning time. And you can see that they took the school-wide expectations. And maybe it'll click to the next slide. We'll see. And they click again, and you can see a picture of what they did. They were ROAR. They, anchored it to an acronym, but they started building these things into the fabric of the way of work, the things they were already doing. So, because we know building these social, emotional, behavioral habits happens in small doses throughout, not once a week for 15 minutes. And that's for the adults and the students. And so one other example on the next piece here is just a school-wide matrix. Some of us have school-wide matrices, and we might put things like wellness or empathy or when I feel upset. We've had traditionally a lot of technical or behavioral types of skills in our matrices. I would argue that's a place where we can also embed social, emotional, pro-social skill sets and behaviors right in the matrix. So again, thinking about commitment and buy-in, it can't be one more thing. And how do we create the conditions for us to do all of these things we want to do to impact outcomes for our students? Look at what you're already doing. Is there a way you can do a small tweak or a small enhancement using what you already have? So another thing we look at is relationships. And I won't spend a lot of time, just going to kind of flip through these next couples because I want to get to some of the big changes. But reminding ourselves when we do those bookends to our day in the morning and the afternoon, that is a chance as either it's district personnel working with administrators maybe, or administrators working with staff, or staff working with students, remembering that the relationship, the connection, holding space, I don't have to have the answers to everything, but I hear you and I see you. That voice, that notion of voice and choice, making it a priority. So if we look forward, we can look at, things that you're already doing and building, making this just front and center at your bookends, I would argue. If we look to the next part of this, it's just the foundation. I'm going to show you some technical things we might do and adaptive things we might do. We'll break that down. But holding space right now is wellness, antidotes to burnout, relationships as the foundation for this work. and knowing that when we look at implementation, we're already looking at ways to include staff, student, family, community, voice, and choice. So the commitment and buy-in, yes, we're talking about staff. We're also talking about students, families, and communities. So in your efforts to continue with implementing whatever it is, how are you always providing opportunities for listening to understand, and then taking that feedback and including it in your implementation efforts? Because if I can't see you, I can't hear you. So we've got to have that space. So I'm going to show you, we're going to move into this last chunk of some things that we can do. And before we do that, I want to set this up. We look at changes as technical and adaptive. We do a lot of technical support. Technical changes might involve, goal setting. Sometimes when I'm working with classroom teachers, I do a lot of technical coaching or technical challenges where we look at practices and procedural types of things and how self-assessment. It might be, looking at a system of self-accountability, things like that. On the other side of that, where we look at buy-in and commitment, are adaptive challenges. And what I've learned is, I don't even know if it's possible, but I'm going to say I have strong feelings that, and I think there's some research to support this, that we can't really make adaptive or address adaptive challenges with technical support. So what I mean by that is an adaptive challenge looks at our mindset, our belief system, our values, identity, purpose, our why. Remember that why we started with? It really challenges the way we show up as a leader in this space, as a coach, to say that I believe that you've got the answers inside you as a person, as a team, as an organization. And I'm going to use some different approaches to uncover that and to look at some, maybe using transformational coaching, where we invite exploration of self, the emotions we have around things. And I feel like this sometimes, in my experience, is where we get some barriers to buy-in, because I have belief systems around acknowledgement. I have belief systems about, well, I teach math. I'm not here to teach social, emotional, behavioral skill sets. So both are important, both technical and adaptive support. And we're going to just go through a couple of examples here. So we didn't have a lot of research that we could find out there, but we did have some, and I think this resonates for us. But really securing that initial buy-in, and sometimes we have to go back to initial buy-in because that's just the nature of the work. But getting back to your why, having clarity, clearly communicating, ongoing. Why are we doing this? Why are we using an MTSS or a PBIS or whatever it is we're doing? Providing an overview that's not just giving the information, but holding space to listen, to understand, because that is the reality for us, those of us who are implementing the things that we're, looking to implement. Hold space for that. Listen to those myths. Listen to understand what's under that, belief system. If we don't listen to understand and bring people together, it's really hard to move through those adaptive type of challenges. Look at maybe smaller groups for professional learning. Oftentimes you've probably experienced this. If you try to do something in a staff meeting, it's a different outcome where if you try to do it and anchor it on to smaller, grade level or department team meetings. Share and engage your staff with your social, emotional, behavioral data. That could be school data. Traditionally, it's been a discipline or attendance data, but there could be other data sets. There could be community data sets. There could be school climate, school culture data sets. But how do we share and engage? I'm going to give you a technical strategy for engagement that has some adaptive features in it. I'll do that in a moment. But really lifting and holding all staff in that, their voice and choice in that space. It's really hard when we especially get into the school year. We get gung-ho I shouldn't say that either. We get really excited at the beginning of the year, and then kind of, things get busy. We get overwhelmed. There's so much coming. We need a break. We forget to do these little teeny micro movements. Quick survey, 2 questions. do the bookends, quick survey. We taught this yesterday as a reteach. How did it go? What do we need to do differently? Just using what you already have within the space of the workday to be more intentional about how we use our minutes, right? If we look to strategies for maintaining, so maybe you've got some initial buy-in and you're kind of seeing an implementation dip or experiencing some other things, whatever it is. Look again to hold space. Like, okay, our data say we're not using reinforcement or acknowledgement for all of our students. Some of our staff still just aren't there with us. We don't even have 80% maybe. How do you uncover? How do you hold space with empathy to listen to understand as one of those skill sets? What is that perspective that it's creating a barrier to that? And then how do you engage in some techniques with adaptive challenges? Making the connection specific to the classroom. I mean, Susan and I were problem solving around this the other day. Like, we've got all the school light in place, but the classroom, we haven't done a really good job of saying, okay, yes, here's a school-wide matrix, but here's a life hack for your classroom. If you had a classroom matrix, on social media, I was listening to one of our colleagues talk this morning about life hacks. As a principal, as a teacher, that a teaching matrix, something that where we operationally define social, emotional, behavioral skill sets, that is something that can make our life easier in the classroom as an administrator. And how do we, bring people into that space and give time to see that, to uncover that, maybe observe it somewhere else? Look at that third bullet where staff were saying aligning initiatives and classroom practices. And we talked about to support SEB, social, emotional, behavioral, that whole domain, if you will. How do we look to uncover ways to align and integrate both within that domain and with the academics? So what are the skills that I need to engage with academics? Susan gives a great example of test anxiety. It's not just that I have anxiety or I'm, need to support with the academic skills, but I have testing anxiety. And what are the social, emotional, behavioral skill sets that I might need support with as well? Looking for social influencers. I'm going to say students are really good social influencers. Engage them in this work. Give them an opportunity to be part of something bigger. Purpose is one of those things we find showing up as an indicator of well-being in that space of research. Give them a purpose, something bigger to connect to. Give the families and the communities. We don't have to shoulder this work as the teachers or the staff in the school community. Let's bring our students into that. Make it easy for us to implement. Part of saying, hey, we're going to implement this new thing is maybe using a tool like Nern offers, where you look at all the resources that are necessary to implement this thing. Do we have them? If not, can we get them? How do we script the path, if you will? When you look at the Heath brothers' research around change, script things out for us until we get fluent with them, because this is new for a lot of people teaching social emotional behavior. Don't make assumptions that all the adults know how to do this, right? Let us see it. Show the impact of our work. If we collect data, we hear this all the time, we have to give it back, right? And not as a gotcha or anything like that. It's a, hey, we did the Great Respect Challenge, and we asked all staff to do 1, 2, 3. And here's where we were, and here's where we are now. What are you noticing, right? Giving it back to them. Or we did a quick survey on Monday morning at our morning bookend, and then Friday afternoon at that bookend. This is what you said Monday morning. Did we move the dial? Did we meet the goal this week? How did it go? What are we going to do differently next week, right? And we talked about recognizing staff. We're already looking at school-wide systems of acknowledging all, that culture of appreciation for students. The staff is equally, and I would argue, if not, probably more important, especially right now. And that's not just in education. That is everywhere where we have workforce, right? And providing ongoing professional development that is using voice and choice. We might have a plan for the year of our professional learning, and we may have to tweak it and adjust because we're hearing this. And if we don't have those opportunities to listen, then we're going to have some missed opportunities. So that ongoing ways of hearing, and the next slide talks about, communication. We've got to have communication and data sharing, this ongoing plan in place. And they can be easy things that we can do if we look. It could be a regular schedule where I'm intentional about communicating. I see you clicking that, Susan. It's just not going forward. That's okay. We'll get it. But it's really just a regular schedule of communication. I had a principal yesterday who was so gracious to allow me to come in and do a learning walk. And he says, my secretary follows me around all day to make sure that I'm sticking to my plan of communication. And it was just brilliant. And, making sure that team meetings are available, like minutes from our team meetings are available for people. If not open, sometimes I've had leaders say, hey, we're going to, open this team meeting up for everyone to come in. So that might be something that we do. And I'm going to keep talking, and I'm going to bring the PowerPoint up since I think Susan might be having some internet challenges. And sharing the data on a regular basis. It's just, we can't say enough about that, right? And so let me pause for a moment. And then I'm going to show you a strategy. But let me pause and see if there's any feedback in the chat, or if you'd like to add some feedback to the chat while we just pivot to backup plan. In education now we have to bend or we'll break. It's happening real time right now. So I'm going to share my screen and give you an opportunity to see if there's anything that you want to add to the conversation in the chat. And Susan, if I know your computer is not cooperating, but if you see anything in the chat, let me know, because now that I'm sharing, it's invisible to me. But one of the things that we saw over and over in, burnout prevention and wellness, in ongoing buy-in and commitment, is always bringing the data back. And what I've learned is it's not just about putting slides up there with data. It's about engaging staff in data. And I use a lot of structures or protocols, I'm not sure what you might call them. And there's a resource there that you can get access to them. But I've used this one for decades now, and I've adapted it for the number of staff or people I'm meeting with and the purpose. And it's called Here's What, So What, Now What. And the here's what is you share the data, or you put the observations up there, and you give adaptive change types of questions or leads. I am noticing, I heard. And then there's the so what. So what do you make of this? I'm wondering. And then there's the now what. So what are the implications for each of these ideas? Can we consider? As a result, can we do this? And over the years, I've learned to add to the bottom here, what is the action we're going to take? So these are the ideas we had as a staff in response to the data, whether it's a team meeting or a grade level or department meeting or a staff meeting. What are the resources we need, and who or when is going to do what? So just one technical, and I would say there's some adaptive techniques embedded in this technical approach support. But when we get to adaptive challenges, one of the most powerful things that we can do is to really look at the ways in which we're showing up with our staff, with our students, with our colleagues. And I have learned so much just from these two books, and I'm not, selling anything. I'm just giving you resources that I have used and Susan have used. But the use of open-ended questions is one of the most powerful tools we can use when we're looking at adaptive challenges. So my mindset, my values, my belief. And so just to give you some examples, remember I said self-compassion, because it takes a lot of practice even to have skill sets of empathy and listening to understand and perspective taking and withholding judgment, all of those things. And one of the skill sets that we might model and try to grow capacity with is the power of the pause and the question. And in one of the books that was there, it was the blue one, the coaching habit. They go through different types of questions, and they give us tools like, these are questions we might ask instead of, here, staff, do this, go do implement, acknowledgement or reinforcement. If there is an adaptive challenge, we may need to ask open-ended questions. There's a technical challenge, like I don't really know how to give behavior-specific praise. I can give that support, right? I can teach that. But if my mindset says, nope, I'm not doing that, then that requires an adaptive challenge approach. And so these are some examples, and they're really powerful to just pause, ask the question, and then be comfortable with the silence while, the people that you're working with are thinking through this. So we've given you quite a bit today and tried to give you some strategies that you can take back and just to kind of think about those things and bring them back to a nice little checklist, perhaps, if you will. Think about, working with your staff, wherever you are in the educational and mental health systems, if you will. You're on a team, you're a classroom teacher even. How do you work with others to identify and communicate the why, right? That's at the classroom level too. Why are we learning this? That's at the school level. Why are we implementing this? At the district and the state levels, why are we bringing in this curriculum? Focus on your staff wellness and strengthening the relationships among staff and students. There's so much going on right now. How do we as leaders create the conditions to cultivate strong relationships? And thinking about wellness as really the foundation for that. Consider burnout. Consider the great resignation. Consider the turnover. All of these things that are in our current reality right now that Susan started out talking about, this current context. And what are some antidotes to that? What are some things we can do in response to prevent wherever we are in that? Thinking about workload. We already look at resource mapping, initiative mapping, looking at our continuum of what we're doing for students and staff and maybe families. But start with what we're doing for students. Can we look at ways to align and integrate our efforts? Can we look at opportunities to de-implement? Stop doing those things. We're already looking at a culture of appreciation and acknowledgement, use of reinforcement to teach comprehension, calculation, walking down the hall, coping skills, right? We're using that as part of teaching and relationship building. And we saw today that it's really one of the most important things we can do to support staff as well. Thinking about buy-in and commitment, what if there's technical challenges and or adaptive challenges. Those technical challenges, that's where your ongoing professional learning. Here's how. Let me arrange a schedule for you to go see another school, for you to go see another classroom. You tell me what would be supportive. Thinking about adaptive changes. So you don't believe in reinforcement. Tell me what's underneath that. Let's collect some data. What do you notice? What would you rather see happening? How would your day look if, thinking about those skills that we can use around adaptive challenges. And most of all, that self-compassion, Kristen Neff's work, taking good care of yourself. What does your support system look like? This is really tough work. And trying to bring along an entire organization of individual humans is a high, calling. And so, Susan, I just encourage you, if you haven't lately assessed your support system, take a moment today. And where is your support system? What are you doing to take really good care of yourself in this space? Susan, anything to add? Any questions that in the chat that you'd like to offer? I'm going to stop sharing.
Thanks, Kimberly. Sorry about the glitch. My computer just kind of shut down. But I don't see anything in chat when I came back on. If folks do have something that they have questions about, don't forget we will be posting that this recording on the pbis.org website, and Austin just posted that link to the specific recording that will be posted in probably just maybe a week or two. If you want to share this with your colleagues, maybe you do a watch party and then maybe action plan around some of the strategies that Kimberly and I offered you all today. We're really glad that you joined us. Thank you so much. I will quickly put my email in if you want to contact Kimberly or myself about anything that you heard today. We are happy to answer questions. And we're really just grateful that you spent an hour with us today. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.